Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Get Ready for the Answer. I'm Bobby Owsinski. I'm a producer, an author, blogger, podcaster, and probably a whole bunch of other stuff. You may know me from some of my books. Hope you have some. You may know me from my podcast. It says 10 years. It's actually 11 years now, and 560 episodes. Still going strong. You may know me from my blogs, my music industry blog, Music 3.0, and my music production blog. And you might know me from some of my courses. But this is all about answering your questions, and these questions come from a specific source. It comes from the Awesome Mix workshop, which we did back in December, and I had well over 200 questions that I couldn't answer all of them at the time, so I promised that I would get to them, and this is how we're doing it. So today, I'm going to answer all your questions on EQing. So let's get to it because there's a lot of them. Here's the first one. From Tom, he says, is there a technique for determining which tracks are competing with or masking another? FabFilter Pro Q seems to have something. Yeah, there's a number of pretty good EQ plugins now that will do this for you. Essentially what happens is you put the same plugin on each channel, and then you ask it to go find what frequencies are masking in whatever places, and then it does some EQ for you in order to unmask everything. Of course, the old-fashioned way is to do it by ear. I shouldn't say old-fashioned, it's the way most people do it still. And definitely what you're going to do is solo up a couple of tracks. It's always in pairs or threes or fours, and find out if there's a frequency that's masking another one. And then, of course, you'll dip it on one track, maybe even boost on another track, or boost it a little higher or lower. This is something that we're going to go over in an upcoming workshop I'm doing. It's my mixing EQ challenge. It's coming up pretty soon, so watch for the info on that. So, yeah, the best way to do it is by ear, and there's, pretty good method. It's actually harder for me to just explain. If you were to watch it and hear it, then you'd get it in no time. But FabFilter, the Pro Q4, especially now that, you can go through and actually, have it do it for you, a lot of it, but there's others as well. Here we go. This is what it looks like. So basically there's 4 different tracks here, and it's going over and it's figuring it out, which tracks are masking one or the other. Here's a good one. How do you separate the kick from the bass with the EQ? Again, something we're going to go over in the EQ challenge that's coming up. Basically what happens here is that there's only so many frequencies, in the low frequencies especially, between the kick and the bass. Mostly the problem comes when you EQ at the same place. So EQ the kick at 60 and the bass at 60, and then they both cover each other up. Essentially, you'll find that one or the other instrument will have to have some higher bass frequencies, and that's usually the problem, not EQing over 100 and EQing too much under 100 hertz. So the bass, for instance, speaks very well when you get to like 120, then you can hear it better, and it's separated from the kick. And of course, make sure you have enough high end at 2K. And with the bass, it's more like 700 that makes it jump out. So you get enough of those frequencies, and you'll get some definition between them. From Bob, is a frequency spectrum analyzer your friend? Yeah, it is. And if so, what's the secret? Well, you can't get caught up on this and just EQ by eye, but what it's best at is it will show you if there's some frequencies that are out of whack, either too high or not enough. And that will give you an idea where you have to EQ. The other thing is, if you're EQing 2 or more instruments at a time, mix elements at a time, then you can go in and you can see, well, wait a second, there's a lot of 500 on this one, there's a lot of 500 in this one, a lot of 500 in this one, and maybe I should get rid of some of that on some of the mix elements. So that's what it does. Most EQs, modern EQs, will now have a spectrum analyzer built in, like on FabFilter, for instance. Okay, from PT, talk about the special EQ frequency settings, ones that make the mix pop. This is something else that we're going to go over in the EQ challenge coming up. There are 6 frequencies, but really what I've found is there's not enough girth a lot of times where that's 60 hertz. You need a little bit of it. You don't need a lot, you need a little bit of it to give the sound some fullness. And usually 500, there's a lot of 500 that happens, and getting rid of some of that suddenly makes things sound a lot brighter, even though you didn't add anything. Now, that being said, 6K, the presence frequencies, are often missing. So you take away a little 500, add a little 6K, and you'd be surprised how much better some tracks can sound. The air frequencies at 10K also help on certain mix elements. So, those are just some that you can look at. But mostly what I find is there's too much 500. And it's mostly from using dynamic, or not even dynamic mics, any kind of microphone that's in a cardioid pickup position. And you tend to get some proximity effect, and that's where you hear some of it. So you get rid of that, and suddenly things get clearer. And then you add some 6K or 6K, and it will get a lot more clear. Okay, from Matthew. You get the best sound in relationship to bass and kick. What frequencies are boosted and cut? Well, again, going back to what we just said, you can't boost the same frequency on each of those. And that's where the problems lie. What you find is that if there's a lot of boosting, for instance, below 100, then the other one should be boosted above 100. And that will give you some definition, and you'll find you'll be able to hear things better. So, for instance, on a bass, one of the big problems is you can't hear it on small speakers, and that's because you're EQing too much below 100, not enough above. So, like 120, 150 are kind of magic frequencies, and sometimes they're overlooked. So that will help a lot. From Antonio, how do you make a snare cut through the mix? What's a good frequency to boost? Well, anywhere from like 900 to 2K. And the caveat being that it's also some frequencies where like electric guitars like to live and vocals like to live. So you have to be careful that you don't cover something up, or, something else isn't covering the snare up. But that's usually a frequency or a area of frequencies that somewhere in there's going to be something that will make it jump out. And again, if you find that there's a lot of 2K, for instance, on a vocal, well, then you can't add that on a snare, so you'd have to go to 1K maybe, or a little lower, and then you'd find that they can both live together, and that's kind of the secret. From David, on your magic frequencies chart, snare fatness at 120 to 240, point at 900 hertz, Christmas at 5K, snap at 10K. What does point mean? Yeah, I should really describe that better. Essentially, what David's talking about is there's a frequency chart, and it's something you'll get in the EQ challenge as well. And it will give you the magic frequencies for each major mix element. So what's point? Think of a point of a pencil. And if you have a piece of cloth and the point, you push the point, it will stick out through the cloth. And that's kind of what point means frequency-wise, where you give it some point and it sticks out. So again, this can be anywhere from 900 to 2K, 2.5K even. And all these frequencies, these are just areas. It could be a little higher, a little lower. But generally speaking, they pretty much work. From Deshaun, struggling with bass. I'm good at compression and saturation, and it seems my basses are either hit or miss when it comes to coming out of the speaker. They often feel in monitors rather than forward, even with less limiting. Any ideas or tips on how to get the bass to jump out of the mix? Yeah, well, I think I said this twice before in other questions, but it usually means you don't have enough above 100. You have too much below 100. When you're EQing below 100, you're adding especially, then you kind of feel the bass rather than hear it. And especially on small speakers, it doesn't translate at all. So usually, if you look to 120, 150, you'll find that the bass will speak better on all speakers, but especially smaller speakers. The other thing too is that 700 is kind of like a magic frequency for bass. It doesn't work on any other mix element, but a little bit of 700 will actually make it jump out of the mix a little bit. So it's kind of interesting. Again, it doesn't work on anything else, but it works really well on bass. Okay, from Andre. During the mixing process, if I like certain instruments in solo and then blend them together, is it better to boost fundamental frequencies or odd harmonics of this instrument? Well, first of all, don't EQ while you're soloed. This is a really bad practice. And the reason why is you can make it sound great when it's soloed and it won't fit in the mix. And the reason why you're mixing is you want all of these mix elements, all of these instruments to work together. And they won't if you solo them up and EQ them. So that's the first thing. So usually what you're doing is you're EQing several instruments at a time, 2 at least. And then that gives you a better idea of how each one is working within the mix. I know several great mixers who have both of them 100 plus, gold and platinum records that never solo. They never solo. They're always just listening to the entire mix and EQing that way. So think of it like that. In terms of boosting fundamentals and odd harmonics, no, that doesn't work. Because each instrument, each song is different, each arrangement is different, everything is different. So you can't just say, go to, if it's an A, then I'm going to EQ the 8 frequency, the 8440, 220, 110, 55 in there. No, it doesn't work that way. Sometimes what happens is if you do that, it actually blends into the track and you don't hear it. So this is not a good way to go about it. From Rod, is EQ typically needed on today's VSTs? Yes. There's no difference between a live instrument and a VST. I mean, a VST, in some cases, where live instruments are, samples now. What happens is, again, every mix is different. And the whole idea is, regardless of, where the mix element came from, you want it to fit in the mix. So you want it to fit with the other mix elements. And the only way you can do that is to listen to them all together, do some EQing to make things, fit better. So yes, you definitely have to, you have to treat it just like any other instrument. You can't just say it's a VST, it doesn't need anything. No, that's not the case. Some need more than others, it's true, because some are very highly processed, but that doesn't mean that they don't need anything. From John, how can you fatten up a drum set loop on one track? Well, there's a couple different methods. So if you have a loop, again, we come back to, does it have enough girth? Girth is, 60 in there, 50, 60. Does it have enough of that? Is there, it might need 80 instead. Is there too much, maybe, that you have to pull out? Sometimes pulling out a little bit can actually make things sound fuller. Is there enough above 100? That's the other thing. So it doesn't really matter if it's one track or, a drum kit. It's the same principle. We've got to make it fit in the mix. So there are certain frequencies that work, some that don't, and sometimes they work, but you add some other instruments in and they don't. But generally speaking, again, we always need some girth frequencies, and we need some fullness, which is like above 100. We need some definition, which is, 2K, again, 4K, 5K, 6K in there, and some air at 10K. From DeAndre, what are your thoughts on mid-side EQ? I think it's a band-aid. It's a last resort. If you use good fundamentals when you're mixing, you never have to use this. And put it like this. There were 50 years of great mixes that never used this once. 50 years of hits that never used this. So why all of a sudden, well, I know why. All of a sudden we're starting to see it on plugins, and it's kind of like, well, hey, we can do that. Let's put it on. It's real easy. It's another feature. Yeah, well, it's not something that you need to use at all. If you're doing it right, if you start with good fundamentals and you're mixing well, you never need this. A mastering engineer, maybe. And even then, they rarely do it. So best not to worry about that. From Jordan, specifically, other than having an EQ on the mix bus, how do you determine what instruments to boost in the 4, 6, or 10K to give an overall feeling of realism and presence? Well, first of all, let's just talk about realism. Realism comes from like 10K, the air frequencies. Sometimes it's not that you hear it so much, is that it feels a little more real. This is especially on a vocal that you'll hear, where it seems a little closer to you. It seems a little more real. So again, when we're going to boost up there in the air frequencies, we're trying to just give it something extra that it doesn't seem to have to make it sound a little more real. Presence is a little different. Presence is more definition, and that's in the 5, 6K, 4, 6K, just 4K to 6K range. So what happens there is frequently, if you're recording something, there's not enough of that. And it could be because of mic placement. It could be because of the mic that's chosen, any of those things. But when I get mixes to listen to, I often find that there's a lack of 6K, 5K in there. And just adding a little bit, you'd be surprised all of a sudden how good it sounds. Is boosting 3K better than 2K on vocals for a good mid sound? It depends on the track. It's strictly dependent on the track and the arrangement, the mix elements. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. If you have something else that has a lot of 2K, you certainly don't want to add 2K onto another mix element because they'll just mask each other. So then you go a little higher to 3K, and then you can hear both of them. So that's the whole idea. So, but you can't just say, oh, do this all the time. No, you have to listen, see what works, what fits. Every mix is different because every song is different, every arrangement is different, the sounds are different, everything is different. So you can't just put a blanket statement on it and say, you boost here, cut here, or whatever. No, what you can say is there are certain frequencies that you have a tendency to put more attention on, or it should be frequency areas. But you can't just put a blanket statement and say, oh, 3K is better than 2K. No, it doesn't work that way. From Dave, would you also look to consider boosting 4 to 6K on reverb returns? Yes, but most of the time we prefer dark reverbs because that's what we hear in nature. The high end of a reverb trail will decay very quickly. So it's not uncommon in nature, just, you go into a cave and talk and there's no high end, the echo is coming back to you. So that's what we're used to in nature. So we tend to roll that off rather than add more. Now, it is possible to boost that if you want the reverb to stand out. If you really want to make it sizzly sounding, so the reverb, you have no doubt there's reverb on this, then yes, you'd add some. And it was not uncommon to do that back in the day on especially plates sometimes, but you wouldn't do it all the time. Sometimes you feel that, oh, let's brighten this up a little bit, but generally not. From Antonio, for bass instruments, how do you know you're hitting that 30 to 60? Is there a plugin that will show you this? Well, yeah, that's a real-time analyzer. Again, without RTAs, without analyzers, people did great mixes for 40 years. Just fantastic mixes. So again, if you have experience, you know what it should sound like, you know if it's there and it isn't, and that's an experience thing. But a real-time analyzer will show you that if there's enough, too much, not enough. And we find that on many EQ plugins these days where that's built in, an analyzer comes with it. So again, you don't want to EQ completely on the visual of it, but it will help you to really find something out. And you can just in a flash say, oh, wait a second, well, there's way too much 40 there. Or, ooh, there's not enough. Let me boost a little. Yeah, does it sound good? But again, you're always listening. Don't do it by eye. From Jorge, does definition in the mix have more to do with carving masking frequencies than boosting others? No, it's a combination of both. So what happens, like I was saying, Often you'll find that there's a lot of 500 because of proximity effect. The microphone's up close to the source, and and especially a microphone that has that's in a cardioid pattern, you won't have that in Omni. So there tends to be a lot of 500, and if you pull a little bit out, sometimes it sounds like you're actually boosting the highs and actually the lows too. And you'll find that there's like way too much often at 500, 600 in there, 400 sometimes. But again, there are times, especially on the microphone that you're using, where there won't be enough definition. You got to look in the 4, 5, 6K range and just a little boost. Now, when I say a little, I'm talking about a couple, 2 dB, maybe 3. If you find yourself at any time with an EQ boosting like 8 dB, there's something way wrong. You shouldn't have to do that. From Christine, which instruments would you definitely add air frequencies to? Air frequencies, again, 10, 12K in there. Vocals for sure. You'd be surprised how much more real a vocal can sound with a little bit of 10K. Cymbals, often. Piano does well. Sometimes acoustic guitar. Acoustic instruments do better. Things like electric guitars, there's nothing above 6K anyway, so it doesn't do you any good to boost any of that there. Same with the bass guitar, there's nothing up there, so there's no point. So there are certain logical mix elements that this works on, but generally speaking, the ones I just mentioned, piano, acoustic guitar sometimes, cymbals, vocal for sure. From Dave, do you advise using a Pultec EQ on the mix bus to enhance and warm the low end? It will certainly do that. And actually, here's a Pultec. This is the popular one, the EQP. And you can see it has 30, 40, 70, and 100. So one of the problems here is that you're limited in the frequencies that you have to boost. And even though this will do a nice job and it's a sound like you can't get anyplace else, it might not be perfect for a mix bus. Worth a try. If it works, it's good, but it might not be the perfect one. You can't just say this is going to work every time. You'd have to try it and then try something else and see which one works best. Oh, one more time. Can you elaborate more on the EQ of the kick drum and bass guitar a little? See, again, it's the same thing. It's if one is boosted at 60, the other one cannot be boosted there. There's only one that should have those girth frequencies. And then it doesn't matter which one, but you have to pick one. So which one is on the bottom and which one is more on the upper frequencies. And it can go either way. So again, just make sure that one of those mix elements have frequencies above 100. And you don't worry so much about the frequencies below. The other mix element will have that. And that it's more elaborate than that. It's something we're going to go over a little bit in the mixing challenge, EQ mixing challenge coming up. But that said, so, you can really go down a rabbit hole on this, but that's kind of the gist of it. You can't have two mix elements, no matter what they are, boosted at the same frequencies or having a lot of the same frequencies. Casper, can you speak about sidechaining, kick, snare, and bass with dynamic EQ? Yeah, well, again, this is another situation where it's a Band-Aid or it's a last resort. If you're doing this right, and if you have good fundamental technique, you'll never have to worry about sidechaining. Just won't. The reason why you're sidechaining, there's two reasons. This is something that you do in electronic music. Now, here it makes sense because you do in electronic music because you're trying to emphasize the pulse of the song. So it's this pulse, and so you're setting up the dynamic EQ or the compressor so it's emphasizing the pulse. And this takes a bit to set up, but that makes some sense. But anywhere else you don't need it because the only reason why you use it in most other cases is I can't get the definition between the kick and the snare. But like I say, there are ways to do this that's, we've been doing it for 50 years and it's worked really great on hundreds of hits. So if you do this right, you never have to resort to this. And it takes a while to set up, and it's just easier to do it the right way. From Paul, why can't we just add some low end in the mix bus? Yeah, you can. You can. Not a lot, but you can. So it's not uncommon to put an EQ across the mix bus and add a little 60 and add a little 10K, or 100 and 10K. When I say a little, I'm talking about a dB or two. If you can't hear a dB or two, you've done something wrong in your mix, and you should go back and revisit it. Because a dB or two you should instantly be able to hear a difference. So it's not uncommon for any mixer to sometimes add, a little bit, a dB or two at 60 or 100 to fill things out. From Steve, thoughts on using a linear phase EQ? When are they useful? Looking to tighten up some drum mixes with lots of microphones. Well, that's not going to really help you, whether it's a linear phase or not. Basically what happens is if we go back to the analog days, whenever we introduce an EQ and you turn it up, for instance, then there's some phase distortion that happens. And what that means is there are certain frequencies that are lagging behind the others. It's very slight. Incredibly slight. So much so that it doesn't bother 99.99% of the people on the planet. And that's the way you should approach it. Now, it turns out that some of the cleaner EQs are also linear phase. So it makes sense but not because it's linear phase. It makes sense to use that because it's clean, and there's a certain time when you use that. Mix bus, for instance, mastering, would be good times to use it. Otherwise, there's a certain color that you get with EQs, and that's why we like them. That's why we use them. But that's not going to help you tighten up the drum mixes with lots of microphones. Really, see, you're thinking that this is going to help the phase, and it's not. The only thing that's going to help the phasing on your drum mics is proper setup, proper placement, and spending a lot of time on placement, and that will do more for you than any kind of fix afterwards. Attempted fix, I should say. And that's it. So thank you for being here. We're going to have a couple more of these because there's still more questions to get to. This is the 4th edition of this that we've done, but again, there's a few others that are coming. Before I go here, Mixing EQ Challenge. It's going to start on Monday, March 3rd. And look down below here for a link that will allow you to join the challenge. It's a 3-day challenge, and we're going to have a lot of fun. Just click on the link, and it will give you all the details. Until next time, thanks for being here, and we'll see you soon.